Hello everyone and welcome to episode 7. Finally, it's time and the episode is here. Let me start by apologizing for the long wait for this episode. It has been a couple of months. The last episode was released 3 months ago and I'm so sorry. Now first off, in the last couple of months, a lot of things still have happened on the Discord server. For instance, we have switched to Ko-fi from Patreon and we have started our own Minecraft server. Let's quickly take a look at our Ko-fi page before we start with the episode. There's not much new, except for the extra option that's called Access to Minecraft with F-on. I've added this option because recently I have started a new Minecraft server, which is only accessible to patrons of the channel, and you can start joining us for as low as €1 per month. And as soon as you become an all-access patron or a VIP patron, you get to bring a friend. Now, why does this cost money? And that's a good question. Now, the main reason is because of the cost of the server. Minecraft 1.17.1 is using a lot of resources, computing power, etc. And that costs a lot of money when you want to host that on a server that has good specs so that you can have a lot of players on the server. And therefore, I have bought a pretty good server. But of course that costs money, and part of the donations that go through Ko-fi are going to be used to afford this server. Other than that, the Ko-fi page also allows you to do a one-time tip by buying me a coffee, which would be amazing because recently I've started to drink coffee again. So feel free to take a look at this page and join our Minecraft server, or of course become a patron to join our coding nights. Now, with that being said, it's time to start taking a look at episode 7. What are we going to do today? Now first off, there are a few small changes that we're going to make to our analyzers that we're using, because some things are just a little outdated and we need to update that. The second thing that we're going to look into today is APIs. How can we send a request properly to an API, then get the JSON or some form of data back, and then convert that into something that we can use in our code. Let's start with the first one. We're going to make a couple of changes to our analyzers, which are telling us to change certain things to be in compliance with certain conventions, but some of those conventions are a little outdated. And thus, we're going to make a couple of changes to make this more modern. The first one is to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of this because the conventions revolving this have changed. Now, you just use it like this, unless you have a private property in which you first have a underscore and then the property itself. So let's get rid of this keyword, and then we can hover over context because of course we'll get the warning again. Then we press the light bulb, we say suppress or configure issues, and then what we can now do is say suppress SA1101 in the suppression file, which will then suppress this warning. Now because we want to suppress this warning in the entire project, we're going to go a bit to the right, get rid of this last part, which is saying target, and scope, as we want to apply this globally. Then we can provide a justification as per why we are doing this. In my case, I will just put here, hey, the conventions are a little outdated, so I'm sticking with not using this. Just like that. Now we can go back to general and see that we no longer get this warning. And when we hover over this, we can actually remove this qualification in the entire project by just clicking here and then clicking apply. As you can see, in all of our files, this has now been removed. Except for locations where they actually have a function, like for instance here. And let's take a look into that, because private fields with the newer conventions start with an underscore. So we'll change this all to underscores. And again, we'll get some warnings saying, hey, field underscore provider should not begin with an underscore. But then we will say suppress or configure issues, suppress SA1309, and an in suppression file. Again, we get rid of the target and the scope because we want to apply this globally. And then as justification, we say, as conventions have changed, private fields do begin with an underscore. Now that that's done, we can go back to our command handler and rename all of these fields. So this.provider becomes underscore provider, this.client becomes underscore client, this.service becomes underscore service, and this.configuration becomes underscore configuration. Now let's just go over all of these names in this file and replace them where needed. So client, just going to copy that here and just paste it everywhere that we have it. We do the same for the provider, here and here. And I see that we missed the client over here. We'll just rename it like this. And then we go up. We do the same for the service. And here. And for configuration, we of course do the same as well. Let's really check if all our files are now correct. And as you can see, now we're more in accordance with modern guidelines. Now, we're still using the analyzers, for instance, to remind us that we want to add comments and explain things to certain methods, or to stay in certain conventions like putting brackets around these and not omitting them. And now that that's done, it's time to start looking into working with APIs. Now, for today's tutorial, we're going to be using the board API, which is very simple. It's just going to give us a nice little bit of JSON containing a little bit of data regarding some random activities that you can do, how accessible they are, how much they may cost, how many people you can do them, etc. Now, board API, the link to that will be here, and you can already see a small little example over here. Now, when working with APIs, it's very important to look at the documentation. You can, of course, just straight go to the developer and be like, hey, I want to do this and this, but, well, if 100 people ask the same question, at some point that developer can get a little irritated. Therefore, they have made documentations, like this one over here, where they try and explain what their API does, what you need to do, if you need to provide something to it, and what actions you can do. For instance, the most basic one is to get a random activity. You just go to this link, which is the sample query, and the expected response will be something along the lines of this. If we go to the Discord documentation for its APIs, we can actually see that they have the same. So if we go, for instance, to a channel and we say get channel, they'll say, okay, this is the action, this is the URL, and this is the description. And then sometimes they'll include a sample response, such as if we go a little down here, you'll see a sample response of what you may get back. These documentations are extremely valuable. They'll give you vital information about what you need to send, what you can expect back, etc. So if we'll take a look back at that board API documentation, we can see that we'll have to send a request to this URL, and then we can expect a response looking something along the lines of this. So if we copy that URL, open up our browser and go to it, you'll see that we indeed get that response. So that's all working really well. But now you may be thinking, like in episode 4, when we implement APIs, wouldn't this get very complex again with using some weird indexing and zeros and knowing where to go? Yes, but there's an amazing tool that actually helps you with that. And just in general, it is a very good practice when you have data such as JSON to make a class where you can convert that JSON to. So that instead of saying data and then square brackets 0, square brackets 1, square brackets 0, you can actually say data dot, in this case, for instance, activity or type or participants. That makes life a lot easier. And there's an amazing tool to help you with that, which is called QuickType. And that is on this website, which will of course be in the link down below. Now, if we press generate C# now, go back to the board API's response that we have over here, and copy the output like this and paste it in here, you'll see that it converts the JSON from here to C# over here. And then we can give this class a custom name. Let's give it the name activity, like that. Now we have a class called activity with some fields like activity, type, participants, price, link, key, and accessibility. Now because we already have a field here called activity, let's change this to a event. That way, we now have just a normal field called activity, type, participants, price, etc. Now you may be wondering, what do all these fields mean? And again, that's why the documentation is so important, because if we go back to the documentation and just skim over it, see what's in there, eventually we will find a table explaining each key and value to us. So the activity key will give us a description of the queried activity. If we look here, activity actually explains, okay, well, what is this? Then the accessibility being a factor describing how possible an event is to do, with 0 being the most accessible. And if we see here accessibility 0.08 means that this activity is quite accessible. Now, the type is a type activity, and so on and so forth. So this actually explains what data we will get in return and what it all means. Now, let's put it to use. We have our model here, as we can call it. But as you can see, there's something here called a parse string converter. And in this class, there's nothing really like a method that would allow us to convert the JSON to this class. So to get that as well, we want to go here on the right, press attributes only, and change it to complete, which will give us even more. Let's quickly go over the code that it now gives us. The first is public partial class event with containing a method called fromJSON. That's very simple. This will simply give us a method from JSON converted to a event, and from an event converted to a string, which is then JSON. These will all be within one class. Then we'll have another class called converter. This is a class that is made by QuickType, and that's all done by them. We don't have to worry a lot about it. It will just help us convert the JSON to the class and vice versa. And the same goes for the parse string converter. In this case, it is then more related to strings, so converting something to string and string to something. So what do? I made a small mistake. This serialized class is actually not part of the event class. It will be a separate class, because this will be able to contain multiple toJSON methods that will convert multiple JSONs to their respective class. So what we'll first do is we'll have one class called event, which is containing all the methods and fields related to events. We'll have a class called serialize, which allows us to serialize an event, or a class in this case, which one of them is an event, to JSON. And then we have this class, which will be helping with that, and this other class, which will also be helping with that. So first off, what we'll do is we'll copy these two classes. We'll then go to Visual Studio and go ahead and make a new folder in which we can store these models. So right click your project, press add, press new folder. Let's call this models. Now we right click this folder, press add again, press class, because we're going to make a class in there in which we can store our event model. Then we want to replace this class with the class that we just generated. We're going to get a lot of errors and warnings because we simply don't have everything here in place yet. So what you want to do is hover over JSON property, press the light bulb, and say using newtonsoft.json, which will already resolve a lot of the errors. Then, because here it's referring to the QuickType namespace, we can actually get rid of this because our namespace is watermelon.models. But since we're going to place this converter class, which I mentioned earlier, in the same folder, we don't need to have any namespaces here, so we can just get rid of it. Now what we can do is create another class over here, add class, and we're going to make that serialized class. Press add, go to the browser, go to QuickType, copy this portion of the code, go back to Visual Studio, and paste it in here. Again, because the namespace QuickType is not required, as we're going to be using this within the same folder, we can just get rid of it. Hover over JSON convert, press the light bulb, and say using newtonsoft.json. Now we go back to our browser and we copy this converter class. Go back to Visual Studio, right click models, press add class, and call it converter. Replace the contents with the portion of the code that we just copied. Click the light bulb, say using newtonsoft.json, and then hover over here and press using newtonsoft.json.converters, and go over here and press using system.globalization. Now we go back to our browser and do the final part, which is this internal class parse string converter. Copy the portion of the code, go to Visual Studio, right click models, press add, press class, and call it parse string converter. And replace the contents with the code that we just copied, like that, and make sure to add a final curly bracket at the end. Now hover over JSON converter, press the light bulb, using newtonsoft.json, and then we're done. Now it's going to give us a lot of warnings about what to do and that we need to provide some explanation here and there for all of the things that we just pasted, and that's of course normal. Feel free to do all of those on your own. You can add comments. This was also discussed in previous episodes, but for now we're just going to look more into the API part, as of course the analyzer is something that we discussed in episode 5. So let's go ahead and go to our event class and take a look in here. Now the first thing that I will do is get in compliance with our analyzer and get rid of the using statements that we simply just don't use. Then we'll move this using part into the namespace like we've done in the previous classes. For instance, if you look in general, you'll see that the using statements are within the namespace. And then we can go back to our event class. And then what I do want to do is add descriptions to these fields. Now, because we get this data from an API, we can just simply put the description of the API as description over here. So we just go here, use the comment like this, so that we have a summary, go to our browser and go to the documentation and just copy the description that we have over here. Go to Visual Studio and paste it in. Now, because we have a get and set over here, the analyzer will ask from us to have get or sets something in this summary. So we'll say gets or sets the description of the queried activity, and then it will be happy. Let's repeat this for all these fields. Now, for instance, sometimes you may stumble upon fields that are simply not described, like this link. In that case, you can just analyze the data you got yourself and consider what to do. For instance, if we were to refresh and see that this link field usually is just not used, we can just have a generic description, something along the lines of gets or sets the link of the activity. And of course, all the other fields that do have an explanation can just be copied from the API documentation. Now that this is done, let's go over here and give our event class a description as well. And we'll do the same here. And then for the from JSON method, we'll give a summary explaining that this method allows us to convert JSON to the event class. As parameter, we have JSON, and then we'll set this to the JSON to be converted. And then returns a converted C event object. Now, when that's done, we can go to our general class. And now you may actually be wondering, how are we going to do this? So first off, of course, we want to start with a nice command, which we're going to call, let's just call it activity. Then we'll bind a method to it, public async task activity, and open it up with curly brackets. Now, how do we exactly make this request? We could, of course, like episode 4 in season 1, use something like a HTTP client or something along the lines of that. But there's a small problem with HTTP clients. To put it all simple, during the entire lifespan of your application, you want to use just a singular HTTP client. And although you can just inject the HTTP client in your application and then try and just use it once, that may get quite difficult. So instead of using a HTTP client, we're going to be using a HTTP client factory, allowing us to create HTTP clients or get ones whenever we need one, while properly keeping them managed. Now, how do we do this? First off, we'll need a special library that's going to help us with this. So we'll go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. In here, what we want to do is search up extensions.http. And then the one that we want is Microsoft.extensions.http, which is made by Microsoft. Select your project and hit install. And now when that's done, you can go to your program.cs, because in here, we want to add a dependency to our service collection. Let's go down here where we have add hosted server command handler, and let's add HTTP client. Now this method takes care of a couple of things for us, allowing us to use a HTTP client factory, which we can then use to get HTTP client and then use it to make a request to an API. So let's go back to our general class. And in here, what we want to do is get that HTTP client factory. Let's go all the way up. And first, we'll start by making a new field called private read only, and then HTTP client factory. And then we want to use system.net.http and then underscore HTTP client factory. And then don't forget the underscore at the start. Then we want to get a constructor. We can simply do this by typing in the keyword ctor and then pressing tab twice, or we can just write it manually by doing public and the class that we want to have the constructor for. So general, and then 2 parentheses, and then 2 curly brackets. Now, there's actually an even faster way to do this entire part. Let's just start over real quick and give you a quick tip. Get rid of this part, type in ctor and press tab twice, then go over here and add HTTP client factory, HTTP client factory, like this. Then hover over here until you get the light bulb, or get your cursor over here, and then create an assigned field HTTP client factory, like this. Now this will not already use an underscore at the start, so let's add one. And then instead of saying this .http client factory equals HTTP client factory, we'll say underscore HTTP client factory equals HTTP client factory. Now in here, we can just inherit the constructor documentation and say DESC HTTP client factory to be used, like this. Now that's done, we have done the most complex part of all. Now we can just go down, and now we can start writing the code that will actually get us the data. To do this, we say var HTTP client, so to get a client that we can use, we do underscore HTTP client factory dot create client. This is just going to get us a beautiful HTTP client that we can use. Then we want to make the request. We do this simply by saying var response, so we're going to store that response into a nice variable, and then we'll say await. This is an async method that we want to run. HTTP client get string async. So we're going to not only send a request, but then also we want it as a string asynchronously. And then we have the URL. Now the URL of the API, if we go back to our browser, go over here, is just something that we can find in the API documentation. So if we go all the way up, we can find it here. And if we go to the main page, we can find it right over here. So let's check out the documentation, copy this URL, go to Visual Studio, and paste it in here. Make sure to add the S after HTTPS. And then we add a semicolon all the way at the end. And now we want to convert this response that we have into our event class. Now, how do we do that? That sounds very complex. Well, not that hard. All we do is we say var event, so this response converted to our class, equals. Now, because event is also a keyword, instead what we'll do is just call it activity from the start and then say equals event. And now we want to have using watermelon.models dot from JSON and then the response, which will convert our JSON to a nice response. Now, there are cases where we might get an error. And in that case, we want to let the user know like, hey, something went wrong, please try again later. So if the activity equals null, then we'll say await reply async, an error occurred, please try again later, like that. And then we do an early return statement. If that's not the case, we can just give the data back to the user. So we'll say await reply async. And then first, let's start with the description. So activity, and then some description, and so forth. Let's put a semicolon here and put some nice stars over here so that that part will be bold. Now, because we want to use inline variables, what we want to do is add a $sign at the start over here. Now, how do we use our model? We simply use some curly brackets so that we can use inline variables, and then we'll say activity.activity. As you can see, we can now just use a class and even use IntelliSense to autofill the properties of our model and thus our data. Then we can say, okay, well, how many participants? So participants. And then we can just simply say activity.participants and we'll get the number. And what about the type? We'll just say type and then curly brackets activity.type. Now you may be asking, wait, is it really this simple? Well, let's give it a shot. Let's run the bot. Let's head over to Discord and try and run this activity command that we just made. As you can see, we now have an activity, go to the gym, participants 1, I have to go alone, and type recreational. And if we run activity again, okay, take a caffeine nap, participants 1, and type relaxation. Now if we go back to Visual Studio, we can even add more data. We can, for instance, also provide it with the price factor. So we can say activity.price, and we can say something along the lines of accessibility. Activity.accessibility, and present all the data that we get from the API. So if we run our bot again, go to Discord and try to run this command again, you'll see that we get some even more data. And that's super cool. Now, I hope that this was useful for you all and that you're now a little bit more comfortable with using APIs and their respective documentations. Now, as we've come to the end of this episode, I would like to say a huge thank you to Runfree, Steve Mobs, Jay Freeb, Femduck, Takashi98, Ali von Pelt, Nicholas Barclay, Talon Strandley, Neregis Vilukas, Mattis, Aki26 Gameplay, 09, Cody Stuma, Cillian Kyog, and Andy Young for supporting our Patreon and Ko-fi page. You guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and I hope to see you all in the next episode. Now, if you have any questions, need some additional support, feel more than free to join our Discord server, which you can find in the description down below. I hope you all have an amazing day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.